In this lecture, we're beginning our story that will extend through the rest of the semester about how various historians and chroniclers of history have understood the practice of historical research. And to begin, we are going to be looking at the so-called founding fathers of Western historiography, and that is the figures of Herodotus and Thucydides. Now, these two figures, what we are going to see in this lecture, is they are going to be significant to historiography and the practice of history itself because they help move beyond sort of the myth making that was history up to this point. And beyond that, by providing sort of a factual basis for history, we are also going to see how these two figures, Herodotus and Thucydides, they focus more on the actions of humans rather than attempting to explain acts of history as occurring as a result of divine will, godly figures, if you will. So again, this is part of that whole effort to basically bring sort of scientific methods into history, hard evidence to explain what has taken place in history. And that is a story and a theme, if you will, that we'll be talking a lot about this semester, about the role of facts in telling of history. And it begins really here, again, with Herodotus and Thucydides. To begin telling this story, we're actually going to talk about an important thing in the study of history, and that is causality. Because what we are going to see here, in fact, is this idea of causality is present at the creation of history and historiography. So causality is central to the study of history. Thus, historians have always been preoccupied with establishing the causes of the events they narrate. In the 5th century BC, Greek historian Herodotus attributed the Greco-Persian Wars to a mix of human emotions, chief among them the overweening ambition of the Persian king. Likewise, his fellow Greek historian Thucydides explained the outbreak of the Peloponnesian Wars by distinguishing between underlying causes, which for his story was the growth of Athenian power, and triggering events, which for his story involved larger powers becoming involved in debates over the city-state of Epidamnus. In short, events in the ancient world prompted historians to reflect on the causes and nature of political change. Now, here's the thing. These two figures, Herodotus and Thucydides, were not the first to talk about causality. In fact, one of the earliest chroniclers of Western history who placed causality at the center of their narrative was a guy by the name of Homer. In his major work, Iliad, however, Homer offered a highly moralistic account and offered mythical explanations based on divine action. And this went against, again, what the works of Herodotus and Thucydides were all about, because these later Greek historians, including Herodotus in the 5th century as well as Thucydides, they began to emphasize rational explanations. This was a move away from, again, moralism and myth to rationality and also realism. Even as Herodotus' account still maintained a moralistic perspective, he sought rational ways to explain why the Greeks and Persians fought based on the customs and values of the two peoples. Thucydides' analysis of the Peloponnesian War later that same century is an even more coldly realistic study of the pursuit of power that emphasizes the need to understand the complexity of human motivations. So, again, the argument I'm making here is the fact that causality existed pre-Herodotus, pre-Thucydides, but at the same time, they started to link up these more rational and realistic elements to the issue of causality, unlike Homer in his Iliad. So I just want to mention in passing, before we move on to the next slide, these are the figures that we're talking about to give you a face to their names. As you can see in the bottom left there, that is a bust, if you will, of Herodotus. In the center, on the top, that is Homer, and then on the top right, that is Thucydides. So these are the figures that we will talk about, particularly Herodotus and Thucydides, throughout the rest of this lecture. Let's talk briefly now about the birth of history. The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero described Herodotus as the father of history. Yet Thucydides deserves such a title as well. In fact, the works of these two figures, Herodotus and Thucydides, were rediscovered during the European Renaissance and quickly became recognized as the foundations of the Western historiographical tradition. Herodotus and Thucydides lived in the Greek city-state of Athens during the 5th century. Now, during this time, Greek mythology was prevalent, and as such, we see the respect for history during this time, because Greek mythology really privileged the preservation of the memory of the past. For instance, and this is a term that you might hear a lot of even up into the present day when talking about history, for instance, Greek mythology included the goddess of Clio among the 9 muses of the arts, and Clio is representative of history. So nonetheless, to go back to the two figures here, I want to talk about their representative works just by naming them, and then we'll get into some of the details in the next slide. So Herodotus is most known for producing the chronicle known as the Histories. And in the Histories, Herodotus describes the Greek defeat of a Persian invasion that took place when Herodotus was just a child. Now, Thucydides, on the other hand, in the Peloponnesian War, recounts the disastrous failure of Athens' attempt to impose its power on the other Greek city-states. Now, in the case of the latter, the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides was actually involved in the events that he described. So this is as much a history as it is a first-hand account of what he experienced during this conflict, the Peloponnesian Wars. I've talked a lot already in this lecture about how, through the persons of Herodotus and Thucydides, we see a movement away from talking about moralism and divinity, the gods, in a lot of the chronicles up to this time, and moving towards more of a focus on rationalism and realism and the facts, concrete things, if you will. And that's where we start to see the emergence of what is known as a scientific history. Again, concrete evidence that is used by Herodotus and Thucydides as well as future historians. So just to reiterate a point that I've also mentioned several times in this lecture, accounts of events had been written prior to Herodotus and Thucydides, but these chronicles often sought to glorify a particular king or demonstrate the hand of God in human affairs. So there's a lot of, again, that otherworldliness in some of these writings. This is a different story with Herodotus and Thucydides, because what we see is, even though they are not the first chroniclers of history, they were unique for attempting to define history as a distinct method of telling the story of the past, which required critically examining evidence to discover and transmit the quote-unquote truth of the past. For his part, how did Herodotus do history? How did he find, again, the quote truth? Well, for him, he was very much into traveling extensively to collect various pieces of information about the several peoples and groups involved in the Persian Wars. Once he had this information, then he did what historians still do to this day in the 21st century, and that is critically examine the evidence to discover and therefore basically transmit the truth, to critically evaluate it and then come up with a conclusion of what he found. Now here's the thing, though biased to a certain degree, because he had actually lived in Athens, Herodotus treated the Greeks' Persian enemies with respect and attempted to explain the motives for their actions fairly. Thus, you can never get over the fact of, again, that there's some bias in historical writing. That's just impossible to move away from, despite what some historians claim is possible by relying just on the facts, if you will. There's always some effective bias because of the way historians interpret things. But nonetheless, Herodotus's efforts here in the histories was far less biased than, again, we would see in there's earlier accounts that sought to glorify a particular king or talk about the greatness of the gods, so on and so forth. So what we are going to see is Herodotus was a move away from that. But at the same time, interestingly enough, Herodotus was often labeled, quote, the father of lies. And the reason why is because Herodotus incorporated fables into his history. So as we see, he's kind of a first step away from that more mythical type of history, but he still couldn't get away from it completely. Now, the other figure that we've been talking about, the person of Thucydides, he was able to move beyond this mythical history. He believed, did Thucydides, that it was necessary to stick strictly to the facts, and that's why I have the phrase next to him, just the facts, please. He rigorously excludes from his narrative, in fact, all elements that, in his view, contain patriotic fiction and poetic exaggeration, preferring instead to focus on the war as a political event with a documented history. At the end of the day, Herodotus and Thucydides paid less attention to the divine and focused more on human nature and its workings. So I want to end this lecture, in fact, by looking at the two quotes that we have on the right. And essentially what we see here is a sort of defense of this scientific history and the approach that is used by Thucydides. So both these quotes come from Thucydides. And what I want to do here, what I want to bring up here is essentially we see an effort by Thucydides here to defend history because it is sort of a battle royale, if you will, of literature during this time in history. Because historians like Herodotus and Thucydides had to compete with the dramatists, with the poets, and the philosophers to make sure that history was viewed above these other forms of writing. So in this first quote to the right, which I want to read here from Thucydides, he does something interesting. I'll get to that in a second. Let me read it first. So here's what he said. In the light of the evidence I have cited, however, no one would go wrong in supposing that the early events I have related happened much in that way, if one would not believe that the past was more like what the poets have sung, embellishing with their exaggerations, or the prose chroniclers have composed in versions more seductive to the ear than true, being unexamined and many because of the lapse of time, incredibly winning the status of patriotic legend. But if one would regard my discoveries from the clearest possible evidence as adequate for what concerns antiquity. So as you can see here, look at this. He talks about how the poets have sung certain things about the past, embellishing with their exaggeration. He talks about the, quote, prose chroniclers who have composed versions of history that were more seductive to the ear than true. So basically he's saying, while these earlier accounts of history, these early chroniclers, they were pleasing to the ear and they were joyful to read, they weren't necessarily true. They lacked the evidentiary base that he had in his writings. He highlights the direct competition, however, the Greek writer saw himself in with the earlier poetic prose versions of the Greek past. And again, he asserts the superiority of his narrative to those of poets and prose story writers, as he called them. In other words, it contrasts both poetic exaggeration or adornment and the persuasive power of popular prose stories with Thucydides' own use of concrete evidence. So he is really telling his readers, I am providing you with a different sort of history, one that again is based on facts, not just colored to make it look good, but lacking the actual truth. Again, quote, truth that we talked about earlier in this slide. So now what I'd like to turn to is the second quote here, right underneath the first. Here he talks about recalling the exact words is difficult for me regarding speeches I heard myself and for my informants about speeches made elsewhere. In the way I thought each would have said what was especially required in a given situation, I have stated accordingly, with the closest possible fidelity on my part to the overall sense of what was actually said. About the actions of the war, however, I considered it was my responsibility to write neither as I learned from the chance informant, nor according to my own opinion, but after examining what I witnessed myself and what I learned from others, with utmost possible accuracy in each case. So here he is describing his research process. In the second quote from Thucydides, he affirms the author's sincere attempt to adhere to accuracy in reporting words and deeds, given his review of evidence and his aim for his speeches, to paraphrase what he described as, quote, the overall sense of what had happened. So even here, I mean, there is some room for questioning whether what Thucydides was actually saying actually happened. But nonetheless, he is offering the reader a bird's eye view, behind the scenes view of what he was actually doing as he was writing this history, which again is based on concrete facts compared to the poets and the prose chroniclers that we mentioned in an earlier quote, in the above quote. But nonetheless, here we see again the emergence of this scientific history in both Herodotus and even to a greater extent in Thucydides. And this is a theme, once again, as we end this lecture, that I want you to keep in the back of your minds. This idea of scientific history, history as fact, how that will remain the same, how that will change over time in some of the different historians that we talked about, that we will talk about in the remainder of the semester.